born in India in 1864, a second block of a family of an Englishman who was in the Indian government service, the colonial service. She'd got older brothers who had gone off to England to school and set up families. So she was the sort of second family group that her parents had. In 1877, she returned to India, from India to England, to live with her father. Her mother by this time had passed away. In 1886, Elsie started training at the medical school for women run by JB. She didn't see eye to eye with JB, and so ultimately set up her own medical college for women in Edinburgh and tried to train medicine that way. It was extraordinarily difficult to get the clinical experience, and a lot of these women had to travel to Glasgow for their clinical training. Even so, an awful lot of these hospitals wouldn't allow female medical students onto the wards, and they were only allowed onto the wards that had women or children. A lot of consultants wouldn't have anything to do with them, wouldn't teach them, and it got really quite complicated what they were going to do. Fortunately, in Glasgow, there was a surgeon called William McEwen, who was ultimately knighted in 1902, who was very sympathetic to women and felt they had as much right to train as men did. And so he was quite a great facilitator of these women getting sufficient knowledge to be able to qualify as doctors. And in 1892, Elsie was qualified with the licentiate of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons in Edinburgh and Glasgow, and became a doctor on the British Medical Register. She carried her postgraduate training by working for a little while at the Hospital for Women in London, mentored by Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. She experienced training in midwifery at the Rotunda Hospital in Dublin. And then she came back to Edinburgh and went into practice, which of course was private practice in those days, with another colleague, and developed a very successful practice. And in those days, they used to do surgery as well, of one sort or another. She became well aware of the inequalities for women, and especially women for working in the working classes. And she did a lot of free work with women in Edinburgh in the lower social classes. Then the battle for equality and suffrage and obtaining the vote became quite important. It came to a head with the Second Reform Act in 1867, which gave many more men the vote, but no women. And this triggered the women's suffrage movement. I want to emphasize that Elsie was very involved with the suffrage movement, but she was never militant and never a suffragette. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson became involved, and Elsie would have known her quite well, of course, from her past training experience. And Elizabeth's sister was very heavily involved in the suffrage movement. And she wrote a letter to her father saying, "There is no question among women who have worked for themselves about wanting suffrage. It is the women who are safe and sound in their drawing rooms who don't see what on earth they want it for." And later on she wrote, when will married women learn that they have other duties in the world other than to obey their husbands? So she was quite militantly pro-women suffrage and the vote. Millicent Garrett Fawcett, who was president of the National Union of Women's Suffragists, was Elizabeth Garrett Anderson's sister. So Elsie had quite a lot of contact as this organisation developed throughout the country. She was involved in the setting up of the Edinburgh National Society for Women's Suffrage in 1867. She became their honorary secretary. She had a busy, thriving medical practice. She worked with lots of poor families. She opened her own hospital in Edinburgh and a hospice in 1904, which was a surgical and gynecological centre, and where she became very successful and had a resident medical officer appointed. Her reputation and skills grew over the next 10 years, as did the suffrage organisation, as did Elsie's involvement with it. And I think it's key to highlight here that this was an extraordinarily well organised group of women. They had networks throughout the country, both Scotland, England and Wales. So here was a body of women driven to a cause, all sitting there in the background. So when war broke out, there was an amazing body of people that could be tapped straight away. The suffrage activity started. She'd been involved with the voluntary aid movement in response to the instability in Europe. She was 50 at the onset of war, and she offered her services to the war effort. She went to the army services at Edinburgh Castle and spoke to a senior officer in the RAMC, offering her medical skills and services, and was basically rebuffed and told to go home, my good lady, and sit still. The offices of the Scottish Federation of Women's Suffragist Societies, you may recognise the building because until the 60s, I think it was the headquarters of the Prudential Insurance Society, St Andrews Square in Edinburgh. An ideal started to form in Elsie's mind, and she wrote, "Imagine an army of women, skilled and unskilled, who only needed organising to be brought into line with the most efficient service the nation knew." So the initial plan, which she sold to the suffrage group and offered to the British Red Cross, was a fully operational hospital manned entirely by women and based in Edinburgh. That didn't work out as the War Office and the British Red Cross declined the offer. And also there wasn't a suitable building to become available. So she decided to offer the unit to the Allies, and she's got in the background all this body of women in the suffrage movements who were being stirred up now with the war effort. So on the 19th of August 1914, so it didn't take her long to get going after war broke out, she wrote a letter to the French ambassador in London. And she sent similar letters to Belgium embassy and to the Serbian embassy. She reported back to the suffrage group that for £1,000, there would be sufficient to pay the salaries of one unit of 100 beds. And each unit would consist of 4 doctors, 10 trained nurses, 6 dressers, 2 cooks, an administrator and a clerk. So fundraising started. And it was absolutely astonishing how the response from the women's suffrage movements throughout the country were. So let's look at France and the one in France. By the 6th of November, £2,800 had been collected. By the 13th of November, she had 2 units ready and fully equipped and manned. A small group went to Calais, where they attended to Belgian refugees who were suffering from the typhoid fever. You may remember I mentioned that last week. 20th of November 14, confirmation from the Red Cross that they were actively seeking a building that could accommodate the unit. And by the 22nd of November 14, Royaumont, now I'm going to again apologise for my pronunciations of this language, formed a former Cistercian abbey had been chosen. It was no longer being lived in. It had been empty for quite a long time. And indeed, at the very beginning of the war, it had been occupied very briefly by the German cavalry when they almost encircled Paris. It was approximately 30 kilometers north of Paris. The French cavalry had left a terrible mess of the abbey. In the first 5 months of the war, the French lost 300,000 men killed, including 5,000 officers, and 600,000 had been captured or were missing or were wounded. So, and they had a particularly ropey medical service, and it was overwhelmed. So, setting out by train from Edinburgh on the 2nd of December, not knowing what to expect, this body of women from the Edinburgh women's hospitals set off. The first women doctors are pictured here, and they were led by Frances Ivans, who was a talented surgeon who had achieved a master's in surgery in Europe, not in England. That still wasn't that far advanced in England. Only the 3rd woman to achieve that qualification. She worked in Liverpool as a consultant in maternity and gynecology. Her surgical skills were said to be outstanding, and she volunteered as soon as the war broke out. So they arrived at this deserted, filthy abbey that had not been lived in since the nuns had moved to Belgium many years before. Could it be turned into a hospital? Dorothy Littlejohn was the cook with them. Those first few weeks, the women scrubbed and cleaned and scrubbed and cleaned. Water was limited. Sanitation was unreliable. And there was no heating. Remember, it was January and December, so pretty cold and damp and wet. All the women's hospital was a novelty to the French army, and they had to pass inspection before they could be permitted to take casualties. They passed at their second attempt and took their first casualties from the railhead in the town of Creil, 12 miles from Royaumont, over the most atrocious roads in France that required all the skills of the ambulance drivers. But a routine gradually developed. The hard-working ambulance drivers in their winter coats made of goat skin. It was a cold job over revoltingly bad roads. An advanced hospital was set up at Ville-Cotteret in the summer of 1917. And during the Germans' rapid advance in 1918, the hospital had to be evacuated rather quickly at a time when it was overflowing with casualties. So after this very brief account of this hospital, we've really just skated over the surface. The war ended. It was in continuous action from the 15th of January to March 19. That's 1915 to March 1919. It treated 10,861 people. They managed to keep meticulous records. 8,752 soldiers with 159 deaths. That's a death rate of 1.83. That's almost better than some modern hospitals. 572 civilians with 25 deaths were also treated. Altogether in outpatients, they treated 1,537 civilians. These amazing women worked miracles in totally unsuitable surroundings. And the French were so grateful that, as you can see in the picture, several of them were awarded the Croix de Guerre medals at the end of the war. At about the same time that the French unit went out to France, a second unit of the Scottish Women's Hospital set sail from Southampton for Serbia. Let's just fill in some historical background. Serbia as a nation had had a turbulent history. Occupied by the Ottomans since the mid-16th century, and having had many skirmishes, ended in a successful Serbian revolution against Ottoman rule in 1817, which was recognized at the Berlin Congress of 1878. Its boundaries and the kingdom were finally decided after their successful victory in the Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913. Then the assassination of Crown Prince Franz Ferdinand at Sarajevo by the Bosnian Serb triggered the invasion of Serbia by Austro-Hungary. They declared war in July 14, and a large army gathered on the banks of the Danube and captured Belgrade. Belgrade's at the top, and they did a sweeping movement each side. Unit of the Scottish Women's Hospital under Dr. Eleanor Sultan set sail from Southampton in early December. The destination was the port of Salonika. Their help was urgently needed in the north of Serbia at Krakovac. The Austrians were actually fought back by the Serbians in that first few weeks, but they did so at the cost of enormous casualties, and they were dreadfully poor conditions. It's a very mountainous area, and there was a very big outbreak of typhus, among other things. The medical services were minimal in Serbia. It had very few doctors and trained nurses, and the wounded and sick were coming back from the battle, even though they'd successfully pushed the Austrians and Germans back and Hungarians back, right the way down in bullock carts, walking, and they really were in a terrible state. So the Scottish unit, having arrived in Greece, urgently travelled north. They moved with a stop at Niš on the way. So they journeyed on to Krakovac. They were being led by Dr. Sultan, and their ultimate destination to set up hospitals was at Valjevo and a couple of other centres a little bit further north of that. Bear in mind that with their donkey carts, their bullock carts, they were carting 100-bed units with all of the equipment with them. Absolutely amazing. So the women rapidly knuckled down and set to nursing the wounded and, where necessary, carrying out surgery. British standards of cleanliness and hygiene were not given up by these ladies in these terrible conditions. As time progressed, the demand for their services increased, and they opened other hospitals in nearby places. The major workload during this time was an epidemic of typhus and enteric fever, and there were a few cases of diphtheria. The living conditions were appalling, and clean water and provision of adequate sewage management was rudimentary or non-existent. The medical and nursing staff were not immune, and some nurses died of illness during this period. During the early part of 1915, there were few major battles, and the Scottish Women's Hospital Unit was more immersed in the management of the disease outbreak than in treating casualties. There were still wounded that needed treatment, and there still needed injuries that needed surgery. A further unit of the Scottish Women's Hospitals had arrived by now to help, but they'd been delayed en route in Malta because they were persuaded to care for the British troops for a couple of weeks who'd been injured in the Dardanelles campaign. Possibly one of the few occasions when the Edinburgh women were allowed to do something to the British Army. By July, the epidemic was over and the workloads were easing considerably. There'd been no new fighting and no new wounds for months. The Scottish Women's Units and other British hospital units in Serbia, and there were other organisations out there. There was a hospital run by Lady Paget, who was the wife of the previous British ambassador to Serbia. And there was the Stobart Unit, another all-women unit run by Mabel St Clair Stobart, another British suffragette and aid worker. They were all considering their future. It was highly suspected that the Austrians and now the Germans, in combination with them, would re-attack Serbia, and there was anxiety about their eastern front. For quite a while, they thought that the Allies, the British and the French, were going to send a unit of servicemen to reinforce the Serbs, but it never came. In November 15, there was an overwhelming invasion burst into Serbia. Germany and Austria came down from the north, and the Bulgarians invaded from the east. The invaders were brutal in their treatment of prisoners and in the civilian inhabitants. The remnant of the army and the majority of the civilian population hurriedly moved to retreat across the Albanian mountains to the Adriatic coast. The Scottish Women's Hospital at Valjevo and beyond were hastily evacuated back to Krakovic, and decisions were taken for the majority of the units to join the Great Retreat across the treacherous mountains in midwinter. They split into two parties, one under Mr. Smith and another led by Dr. McGregor, who'd had the unit that was at Malta. Dr. Ingles and Dr. Hutchins decided to stay behind with the most seriously ill patients, and they became prisoners, continuing to work caring for the wounded, but ultimately were repatriated to Great Britain via Vienna by the Austrians. They tell the story of Dr. Ingles refusing to sign a certificate attesting the good behaviour of the German army. Her reasons and the German response to this was well known, but we think she refused to sign. It was 4 weeks just before the Germans shot Edith Cavell as a spy, and I don't think she was happy to say that they'd been well behaved towards them. And this was the routes that the various civilians, the hospital people, the army, across those mountains in midwinter to get to the Adriatic. One nurse of the Scottish unit died on the journey from a head injury in a fall, and she was buried on the mountainside. It took 7 weeks on the trek with scarce food and bitter cold. The maximum climb over the mountains was to 7,000 feet. Ultimately, everybody was removed by boat and evacuated to Italy, but not without its dangers because of Austrian submarines. Thousands of the civilians, and especially frail, undernourished elderly and children, lost their lives on that journey across the mountains. A Serbian writer said, if the skies were all paper and the sea were all ink, we could not even then write the sorrows of our country. Anyway, in August 1915, a group of the women who were sent from Scotland to reinforce the hospital at Valjevo went to Salonika and set up a recuperation hospital there. Most of the soldiers from that retreat re-established in Corsica, retrained, and received medical attention from Scottish women's hospitals. Of the 3,000 recruits and decimated regiments that arrived in Corsica from Serbia on the Great Retreat, 30,000 schoolboys and students from Serbia who'd set out on the retreat, only 7,000 survived to get to Corsica. It's amazing what these women did and how grateful Serbia was for them. They did things apart from sticking them on stamps. Altogether, there were 13 hospitals set up by the Scottish women. As I said, the Serbian army had regrouped, retrained, and was about to move to the southern end of the Eastern Front to support the Russian army against Bulgaria and the Austro-German Axis. The Serbian minister in London in 2016 asked Dr. Ingles if the Scottish Women's Hospitals would provide a field hospital service for the Serbian division in Russia. So very rapidly, the women's hospitals managed to equip and dispatch 2 field hospitals. Each of them had a motor transport division attached to them. This map shows the Eastern Front at around this time. That's the heavy blue line. Units set sail from Liverpool on the 30th of August 1916, sailing to Archangel, right up in the north of Russia. They then travelled by rail with all of their equipment, beds, blankets, drugs, operating theatres, by train, all the way to Odessa. It took 11 days. They were heading from Odessa towards the Dobruja area, where the main Remain Serbian troops were fighting on that front. They rested in Odessa for a few days, and then they set out to go towards the front. They travelled, first of all, to a place called Reni. They then joined the Danube and went down to a place called Zrnavoda. Their names have all changed, and I find it really struggle to pronounce these names. And from there, they were heading to set up their base camp at Medjugorje. All the transport and the stores were moved on 2 barges. This was the coordination centre for the Serbian army, and a hospital was set up overlooking Medjugorje, and it was next door to the Russian Red Cross hospital. The situation was pretty grave. The first Serbian unit in action had suffered heavily. They'd gone into the battle with 14,000 strong, the Romanians on the left flank with the Russian army on the right flank. Very soon the enemy had broken through the Russian flank, leaving the army in disarray. And the Serbians stood their ground, fighting for 24 hours on 2 fronts. And they came out with only 4,000 men. Things continued to get worse for the army, and things were rather complicated by the beginning of 1917, was when the Russian Revolution had started. And these early days of unrest and rebellion had a serious effect on the efficiency of the Russian military. The Scottish Women's Hospitals were ordered to evacuate and retreat, and in the event, they were the last medical units to move back. And so the chaotic retreat was pulling back ahead of the rapidly advancing enemy to Braila. They camped where they could, scrounged food, and set up temporary dressing stations to treat the hundreds of wounded that were converging on them. The enemy advanced, and they retreated further by barge until the river was blocked, and then by road to Galicia, a large seaport on the Danube, and then eventually back to Odessa. They're pretty chaotic on the retreat, with locals retreating soldiers, and they moved back as fast as they could. This was in October 2016, at the beginning of a really grim winter. The Danube was quite useful as a barrier, really quite a big river. But once the winter came and it froze, it was possible to cross it. And of course, the Germans managed to cross it. By the end of November 16, German forces were across, and the Allied forces and the Scottish Women's Hospitals were in rapid retreat. Anyway, they arrived and set up a hospital in Odessa in January 17, where they were for the next 8 months. And so, from the inspiration of one strong, independent woman, Elsie Ingles, who knew her own mind and had the drive to get what she wanted, up came 13 hospitals staffed by women in many battlefields and in places of much need. The Serbs never forgot the women of the Scottish Women's Hospitals, but we seem to have done so. Despite the amazing achievements by the women doctors during the First World War, once it was over, women doctors were marginalised again. It was a long and slow road for them to get equality. When I went to medical school in 1965, only 1 in 10 students in my year was a woman. Today, there are as many female medical students as male ones, but women surgeons are still in a minority, and it's still a male-dominated environment, although getting better.